Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Stories, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. It started like any other winter morning in Deer Park, Washington. But inside one quiet home, something was terribly wrong. A mother of five was found lifeless in her bedroom. The scene was staged in a way no one could forget. There was no break-in, no sign of forced entry. But there were messages, texts from her phone, sent after she was already dead. Who did this? And why would they go so far to humiliate the victim even after death? This is the story of Shannon Starbuck, and how truth unraveled behind a carefully constructed lie. December 3rd, 2011. Spokane County deputies were dispatched for a welfare check on a woman who hadn't responded to calls or texts in over 24 hours. There was no 911 call, no forced entry reported by neighbors. But inside 1752 East Morgan Street, something didn't add up. Shannon Denise Starbuck, 42 years old, was found deceased in the master bedroom of her Deer Park home. Her body lay flat on her back. Her arms had been positioned deliberately, and objects of a sexual nature had been placed around and on her body. The scene was not chaotic, it was controlled, intentional. Investigators immediately recognized that this wasn't just a homicide. It was a statement. There were no signs of struggle in the hallway, no evidence of forced entry. The windows were locked, the doors were secure, but something felt wrong. Too clean, too timed. The washing machine was running when deputies arrived. Inside, they later found bedding, including the master bed's missing sheets. The exterior of the machine had been wiped down. No fingerprints, no smudges. The bathroom counter was spotless. Not routine cleaning, spotless, freshly sanitized. Even the light switch had no prints. Investigators called it a staged scene, with an emphasis on humiliation. There was no sign of robbery, nothing was missing, but the presence of deliberate post-mortem positioning and the total absence of physical chaos signaled a controlled environment. This wasn't panic, this was planned, but the most unsettling clue came from the victim's cell phone. In the hours following her estimated time of death, Shannon's phone was still active. Text messages were sent from her number to several men she had met on online dating platforms. The tone of the texts was flirtatious, even suggestive, an eerie continuation of her digital life after her physical one had ended. But something about the texts felt off. A few recipients noted that the grammar didn't match how Shannon usually wrote. Some messages were oddly vague. Investigators obtained digital logs, and that's when the timeline broke wide open. Cell tower data revealed that Shannon's phone had traveled briefly after her time of death, pinging a tower miles away before returning to her home's vicinity. The same data would later match another individual's phone movement, someone close to her, someone who knew her routines, someone who had motive. For now, though, all they had was a dead woman, a sterilized crime scene, and a phone acting like nothing had happened. Deer Park wasn't used to this kind of crime. Population under 4,000. A place where neighbors wave and doors stay unlocked. But what happened in that bedroom changed everything. As one investigator noted in a report, the data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. Luminol testing in the bathroom revealed faint traces of blood near the drain. Blood not visible to the eye, but enough to indicate a body had been cleaned or prepared. Samples were collected. Forensic analysts noted that while the killer took steps to remove trace evidence, they'd underestimated how long biological material can linger. There were fibers under Shannon's fingernails, residue on her neck. Time-stamped digital footprints that would become critical. Shannon Starbuck was a mother of five, a former dental assistant, recently divorced. She was trying to rebuild her life, working, dating again, navigating custody issues with her ex-husband. By all accounts, she was doing everything she could to move forward. But someone didn't want her to. And they'd made sure the final image of her life would be permanently distorted. Before the blood tests, before the DNA reports, before the phone data maps and clean-scrubbed appliances, there was Shannon, a woman who, just 48 hours before her body was discovered, was texting her children, scheduling work appointments, and trying to rebuild her life one deliberate step at a time. Shannon Denise Starbuck was 42 years old at the time of her death. She was living in Deer Park, Washington, a town that didn't see much violence, much less murder. Recently divorced, she had been granted full custody of her 5 children after a long legal process that had included multiple hearings, conflicting affidavits, and a child support judgment. Her ex-husband, Clay Starbuck, had been ordered to pay over $9,900 in back support. He wasn't happy about it. That was documented. Chanin was a former dental assistant who had left the profession to raise her kids. In the wake of the divorce, she had started working part-time while also managing the logistics of a large household, school runs, meal planning, dentist appointments. She was also using online dating platforms. It wasn't a secret. Her friends knew. Her children knew. It was her attempt at moving on, and she was transparent about that. On December 1st, 2011, Chanin had an appointment at a local business. She never showed up. That was unusual. Records later confirmed she had spoken to one of her daughters around 10:30 a.m. That would be her last known communication. The day before that, November 30th, she was seen picking up groceries and mailing Christmas cards. Receipts from Safeway and USPS were time-stamped and matched to surveillance footage. There were no signs she was distressed or fearful, no indication she was anticipating violence. In fact, according to a co-worker who exchanged texts with her that evening, she sounded hopeful about an upcoming second date. Investigators later reconstructed those final 48 hours from text logs, retail timestamps, and cell tower data. Her movements were confined to a tight perimeter: home, store, post office. She was home by 7:42 p.m. on December 1st. Her garage door was closed. No outgoing calls after 10:30 a.m. the next morning. What made the silence more disturbing wasn't just the absence of activity, it was the digital illusion that followed. On December 2nd, starting around 12:15 p.m., messages began going out from Chanin's phone. Not replies, initiated texts, sent to male contacts from dating platforms, flirtatious in tone. Some asked for pictures, others proposed meeting up, but none referenced her kids, her job, her tone. Recipients later testified that they felt weirded out. One said it didn't sound like her. Another noticed her punctuation was off. A few responded politely, assuming she was busy. One didn't respond at all. That data was retained. When the phone was examined, digital forensics confirmed the messages were sent manually, not scheduled. The timestamps overlapped with Chanin's window of death as determined by preliminary autopsy. There was no way she had written them. Meanwhile, Clay Starbuck told investigators he had last seen Chanin earlier that week. He said they'd spoken briefly about scheduling for the kids, but that there had been no issues. He mentioned she seemed tired and stressed. When asked for specifics, he declined to elaborate. Detectives noted his tone: flat, measured, not entirely cold, but disengaged. Later, when reviewing his phone records, they saw something curious. Clay's device had traveled toward Chanin's neighborhood twice on December 1st. Both trips occurred within the time bracket forensic analyst placed her time of death. He had not mentioned those visits in his initial statement. From the outside, Chanin's life looked mundane. A divorced mother navigating a routine most single parents would recognize. But inside that house, during those final hours, something broke that routine. Something violent. As one detective said off record, she had no time to fight. Whoever did this knew how to end it quickly and quietly. At the medical examiner's office, the body was preserved and logged. External examination showed no signs of blunt force trauma to the extremities. The primary injury was localized to the neck and face. Cause of death: manual strangulation. Time of death: estimated between late morning and early afternoon on December 2nd. There were no defensive wounds on her forearms, but under her fingernails, skin cells, fingertip bruising, redness along the jawline. It had been close, personal. The question remained, who would benefit from her silence? When investigators returned to the residence at 1752 East Morgan Street, their objective was not emotional closure, it was control. The house had already spoken once when officers found Chanin Starbuck dead in her bedroom. But now it was time to interrogate the environment. The front door showed no signs of forced entry, no pry marks, no shattered frame, no broken lock. The rear sliding door was secured from the inside. Windows intact, screens undisturbed. A brief note was made. Whoever had entered that house had either been invited in, had a key, or knew how to gain access without triggering alarm or damage. There was no alarm system, which simplified entry for someone familiar with the layout. The home was a two-level structure in a quiet residential neighborhood, nothing fancy but clean and functional. The garage had an interior access door into the kitchen. That door was also intact, no damage. The only smudge prints lifted came from the handle inside, and they belonged to the children, verified by their prints taken earlier in the day. The master bedroom, however, showed an entirely different level of awareness from the offender. The bed had been stripped completely, no fitted sheet, no pillowcases. The comforter was folded neatly in the hallway laundry basket. The washer was in operation when the first responders arrived. It contained linens and a set of pajamas, spinning mid-cycle. Crime scene analysts documented the placement of every item in the room. There were no personal effects scattered, no broken items, no overturned furniture. The room had not been ransacked. It had been sanitized. The outer casing of the washer and dryer had been wiped down with what later proved to be a lemon-based surface cleaner. It removed most oils, including latent fingerprints. A forensic technician flagged this as irregular. People don't normally clean the outer panels of their laundry machines before running a wash. More importantly, the washer had been programmed for a full hot water cycle with an extra rinse. Investigators reviewed the placement of the body once more. Shannon had been arranged on her back, arms to her side. Sexual paraphernalia had been positioned with precision, not haste. That level of composure, investigators agreed, indicated post-mortem staging. And staging wasn't usually about hiding the crime. It was about reshaping how it was perceived. The floor was tested for blood traces using Blue Star reagents. No pools were visible to the naked eye, but light chemical reaction occurred near the side of the bed. Someone had cleaned the area, but microscopic protein traces persisted. The nightstand drawer was slightly ajar, but otherwise untouched. Her phone had been found plugged in downstairs, battery drained. In the bathroom adjacent to the master suite, technicians discovered hair strands in the sink and a long streak of moisture across the countertop. Swabs from the drain tested positive for Shannon's DNA, along with a second male contributor. That profile had not yet been matched. The lack of forced entry, the systematic cleaning, and the precise nature of the body positioning suggested a single conclusion. The killer was in no rush. They knew how much time they had, and they weren't afraid of being interrupted. From a procedural standpoint, the house offered more silence than chaos, but that silence had weight. The living room remained undisturbed. No footprints in the hallway, no trace of mud or outside debris. The offender didn't enter impulsively. This was a measured, methodical process. Lead investigators note, this was not a burglary, not a rage kill. It was an execution with intentional delay. Forensic sequencing placed the time of death within a tight 3-hour bracket based on lividity and core temperature. The internal temperature at time of discovery had stabilized at 74.8 degrees. Backtracking based on standard decomposition rates in a climate-controlled environment, analysts determined Shannon had likely died between 11:30 a.m. and 2 o'clock p.m. on December 2nd. This timing overlapped directly with the window when her children were in school, and the house would have been empty. Whoever entered knew that schedule. By day's end, detectives had more questions than answers, but the profile was beginning to tighten. Someone with knowledge of the house, the family's routine, and enough composure to clean and stage a body, all while manipulating a digital alibi through the victim's phone. It wasn't just a body they found in that Deer Park home. It was a crime that kept whispering long after the room fell silent. By the time forensic analysts secured the house on East Valley Street, the initial evidence already suggested this wasn't a simple case of domestic rage. It had choreography, cruel, deliberate choreography. But what emerged next wasn't in the room. It was in the cloud. Shannon Starbuck's phone had continued living for nearly a day after her death. Detectives had the timestamp 8:08 a.m. December 2nd, 2011. That's when the last verifiable sign of life had occurred, an outgoing text to her daughter. But as they would later confirm, that message wasn't written by her. After the body was discovered, law enforcement obtained Shannon's phone records under warrant. They quickly noticed a disturbing pattern. Over a dozen text messages were sent from her phone between December 2nd and December 3rd. Most were to men she had recently communicated with on dating platforms. Some were flirtatious. Some referenced future plans. All were lies. Shannon was already dead. At first glance, it looked like misdirection, a tactic to delay discovery, to confuse the timeline. But the digital trail was sloppier than it seemed. Each message had metadata, IP traces, network pings, tower handoffs. It didn't take long for Spokane County's digital forensics team to realize the messages hadn't been sent from Shannon's home. They originated miles away, from a location linked to a familiar name. Investigators focused on the Starbucks shared custody drop-off point. They recovered surveillance footage from a nearby business showing Clay Starbucks' car moving in and out of that area during windows that coincided with the spoofed texts. Even more telling, the phone itself went offline just hours before the police were called. It hadn't simply lost power. It had been physically disabled, either shut down or destroyed. A forensic sweep of Clay's home computer turned up deleted email drafts, several eerily similar in tone and content to the texts sent from Shannon's phone. One message, never sent, referenced a fake romantic encounter and mirrored language used in a text delivered post-mortem from Shannon's number. This was no coincidence. It was a pattern. And in homicide investigations, patterns often expose intent. What made the situation more disturbing was the way the digital interference extended beyond just messaging. Clay had accessed one of Shannon's dating profiles shortly after her death. The log showed failed password attempts, then successful login from an IP address tied to his home network. Investigators retrieved screen captures showing the profile being edited, adding salacious content that hadn't been there before. This wasn't just an attempt to delay discovery. It was an effort to rewrite the victim's reputation. And reputational smearing, especially when paired with post-mortem manipulation of the body, is rarely without motive. Some details may seem clinical, timestamps, IP ranges, tower triangulation, but these pieces form the spine of the case. It wasn't a single drop of blood or a lone fingerprint that pointed to deception. It was the artificial life of a phone that should have gone silent when Shannon did. I've covered dozens of cases where killers tried to outsmart the digital trail. They almost always overestimate their ability to mimic someone else's voice. But here's the truth. A lie, even in text, has a fingerprint. And Clay Starbuck left his all over this one. The team later used a cell phone forensic extraction tool to reconstruct the deleted data on Shannon's phone, revealing that at least 2 applications had been accessed after her death. Both were used for messaging, and both showed unnatural typing rhythms, shortcuts she never used, punctuation she never omitted. It was, in essence, a ghost typing back. From an investigative standpoint, the digital interference raised 3 red flags. Motive to defame. A clear effort to reframe Shannon's character post-mortem. Access and opportunity. Clay had technical access and was unaccounted for during the timeline in question. Intent to obstruct. Using the victim's identity to delay discovery or implicate others. At this point, law enforcement hadn't made an arrest, but the net was tightening. The digital evidence didn't just expose a cover-up. It began to unravel a strategy. Before this, the physical evidence had been troubling but inconclusive. Now it had a counterpart, a behavioral footprint, deliberate, vindictive, and traceable. The forensics team compiled a detailed report, aligning message timestamps with known tower locations, cross-referencing each with Clay's cell records and vehicle GPS logs. They weren't guessing anymore. They were drawing a map that didn't just show where the crime happened, but who kept trying to bury it. Deer Park, Washington, December 2011. By the morning of December 5th, just 2 days after Shannon Starbuck's body was discovered, the digital forensics team had begun sifting through the raw data from her mobile devices. The physical evidence at the scene had already pointed in a specific direction. No signs of forced entry, clean surfaces, and a washing machine mid-cycle. But it was the digital breadcrumbs that would start clarifying the timeline. Shannon's phone had been recovered at the crime scene, but the metadata told a story entirely separate from the one Clay Starbuck had offered investigators. Starting the evening of December 1st, hours after the estimated time of death, Chanin's phone had continued sending messages to several men she'd been in communication with via dating platforms. These weren't just routine messages. They were cold, impersonal, lacking the tone and humor her contacts had grown familiar with. Some even contained odd phrasing, switching between formality and slang, as though written by someone trying to imitate her style without fully understanding it. Investigators had a term for this: post-mortem impersonation. And in most homicides involving intimate partners, it's considered a deliberate redirection tactic. From a server analysis, authorities found that messages were sent from Chanin's phone while Clay's own device was inactive, allegedly dead due to a drained battery, according to his initial interview. But cell tower pings betrayed that explanation. Clay's phone, when switched off, had last connected to a tower just a few miles from Chanin's home. Then there was silence, until the following morning when it reappeared on the grid again, this time near his residence. Location data wasn't the only thing failing to match Clay's account. Surveillance footage obtained from a nearby gas station on the afternoon of December 1st captured a figure matching Clay's height and build using a payphone. That call, according to phone company records, had been made to Chanin's voicemail. While this alone wasn't enough to secure a conviction, the inconsistencies kept stacking. Detectives also accessed Chanin's online accounts. One of the first things they noticed was that someone had logged into her email and dating profiles after her time of death. One specific login occurred using a device that was later confirmed to belong to Clay Starbuck, connected to his home IP address. A second login came from a coffee shop Wi-Fi on December 2nd. Reviewing the cafe's surveillance footage revealed Clay sitting alone, staring down at his phone, then closing a laptop roughly 10 minutes before the suspicious login was time-stamped. In isolation, none of these elements could definitively tie Clay to the scene. But in the aggregate, digital movement, data manipulation, and behavioral patterns, they painted a picture far more coherent than his explanation involving a car repair and a dead battery. One of the lead investigators would later remark, "The technology told a version of the truth Clay couldn't edit." Beyond the screens, detectives revisited Clay's physical behavior in the hours after Chanin's death. Witnesses described him as unusually controlled, lacking urgency when speaking about his ex-wife's disappearance. He told one of their children that Chanin was probably out meeting a guy, only hours after she failed to pick the kids up, something that was wildly out of character for her. Chanin's own search history in the weeks leading up to her death was also revealing. She had recently researched topics related to custody rights, restraining orders, and digital security. One particular query, how to detect if someone is tracking your phone, stood out. It pointed to a growing fear, perhaps a realization that someone close was watching her more closely than she knew. By December 7th, investigators had compiled enough circumstantial and digital evidence to begin securing warrants for Clay's personal devices and home. What they sought next wasn't just presence, it was intent, preparation, and psychological control. This chapter in the investigation wasn't about what was left at the scene. It was about what continued to move, speak, and interact after Chanin was already gone. The longer a lie is maintained, the more fragile it becomes. By the second week of December 2011, investigators in Deer Park had stopped looking outward. The focus had shifted, permanently, onto Clay Starbuck. From the start, Clay had provided what seemed like a confident and rehearsed timeline. He was home most of the day, only leaving briefly to fix a car and pick up his daughter from school. He insisted his phone had died, and that he hadn't seen Chanin since dropping their children off that morning. But law enforcement wasn't accepting claims at face value anymore, especially not from a man who had already lied about using Chanin's phone after her death. Detectives requested all mobile data associated with Clay's phone. Using subpoenaed records and triangulation from cell towers, they mapped out his movement on the day Chanin was killed. The results were telling and damning. The cell data showed his device pinging far from the auto shop he claimed to be working at. In fact, the pings placed him right in the vicinity of Chanin's residence during a critical window that matched her estimated time of death. One signal hit near the Deer Park water tower less than half a mile from her house at a time he swore he was miles away. Another ping revealed movement between cell towers just minutes before Chanon's phone sent those misleading texts pretending she was alive. It wasn't just inconsistent, it was impossible to explain away. When confronted, Clay doubled down. He blamed faulty GPS, tower misrouting, or possibly someone else using his phone. But the coverage zones were precise, and his account began to crumble further when detectives pulled surveillance footage from a nearby gas station. On the day of the murder, Clay's car, same make, model, and license plate, was seen turning onto Chanon's street. The timestamp left no ambiguity. I remember hearing one of the lead detectives describe it plainly. If Clay had nothing to hide, why did every new piece of evidence contradict him? It was no longer about proving motive. It was about layering truth over deception, data over denial. They examined the physical timeline next. According to forensics, the sheets in Chanon's washing machine were still damp when discovered, suggesting they had been laundered within a few hours of police arriving. The body itself had early signs of decomposition consistent with death occurring late morning to early afternoon. Chanon's phone had gone inactive shortly thereafter, until Clay activated it again. In isolation, any one of these points might raise eyebrows, but layered together, the narrative became irrefutable. There was also the matter of the scratches on Clay's neck, noted by officers days after the murder. Initially dismissed as from his dogs, Clay provided no photos, no corroborating detail, and no veterinary proof. Swabs from under Chanon's fingernails taken during autopsy would later contain trace amounts of male DNA. The lab wasn't ready to say whose just yet, but it was a thread that would continue unraveling in court. Then came the bank records. Chanon had withdrawn cash a few days before her death. That money was missing from the house. Investigators found no signs of robbery, no signs of forced entry, just selective removal of items that could suggest a staged scene. Clay, when asked, claimed he didn't even know she had cash at home, but two of Chanon's close friends told police she mentioned preparing emergency funds in case something happened. Patterns of behavior began stacking. Clay had searched online for remote access to voicemail systems days before the murder. He had also looked up forums on how long cell towers store user location logs, a detail no average person is casually curious about. As this evidence mounted, the question wasn't whether Clay had lied. It was whether any part of his story had ever been true. Even those who initially gave him the benefit of the doubt, co-workers, church acquaintances, family, were beginning to pull away. One former friend admitted he didn't feel right continuing to defend Clay after seeing how many facts were surfacing that directly contradicted his statements. The deeper investigators dug, the more apparent it became. Chanon's murder wasn't a random act. It was planned, controlled, concealed. The attempts at misdirection, text messages, cleaned sheets, fabricated alibi, weren't signs of panic. They were calculated, and each falsehood only brought them closer to the truth. By the time detectives had reviewed the preliminary forensic data and re-interviewed key individuals, a clearer, albeit disturbing picture had begun to emerge. Yet it wasn't just what Clay Starbuck did that disturbed them. It was how carefully he tried to cover it up. Investigators obtained full access to Chanon's cell phone records and recovered logs from her email and dating profiles. On the surface, several messages had been exchanged between her and online suitors even after the suspected time of death. But these communications lacked her usual tone. There were grammatical inconsistencies, short, out-of-character phrases. It took a trained eye to spot, but the lead detective recognized the digital fingerprints for what they were: deliberate manipulation. Digital forensic analysts confirmed that Chanon's phone had been used post-mortem to send those messages. More tellingly, the IP addresses tied to those communications traced back to Clay Starbuck's known Wi-Fi connection. Geolocation data placed the device sending those messages in the immediate proximity of his residence during the critical time window, hours after Chanon was last confirmed alive. The pattern was now unmistakable. Clay wasn't merely trying to create doubt, he was constructing an alibi. He wanted the world to believe Chanon was still alive and active, even after he had ended her life. During a follow-up search of Clay's own devices, investigators discovered that he had logged into Chanon's online dating accounts using her saved credentials. He sent flirtatious and sometimes crude messages to multiple men she had connected with. Each message was time-stamped after her estimated time of death, based on the autopsy's conclusion. Late on the night of December 1st or early December 2nd, the coroner's findings only reinforced the timeline. Chanin had died from manual strangulation, with petechial hemorrhaging around the eyes and deep bruising on her neck consistent with sustained pressure. Her nails showed signs of defensive struggle, and samples taken from beneath them revealed Clay's DNA, concentrated in precisely the areas that corresponded with the injuries. When the evidence was presented to Clay during interrogation, his response remained calculated. He claimed he hadn't seen Chanin since dropping off their son at her house the morning of December 1st. He said his phone had died that day and that he'd been home alone working on a car battery. But the forensic timeline rendered that claim untenable. His phone had been active, and the pings placed it near Chanin's house hours after she was presumed dead. There was more. Surveillance footage from a nearby gas station captured Clay purchasing cleaning supplies late at night. Investigators also found it peculiar that the washing machine in Chanin's home had been running when officers first arrived, mid-cycle, with no one home. The bedding had been stripped and laundered. The washing machine door had been wiped clean of prints. These were not the actions of someone who had stumbled across a tragedy. They were the acts of someone with intent to eliminate evidence. Back at the lab, technicians found a crucial anomaly. The one fingerprint that remained on the outside lid of the washing machine belonged to Clay Starbuck. When questioned about it, he claimed he must have leaned on the machine when doing laundry for the kids on a previous visit. Investigators didn't find the explanation credible. One veteran detective later remarked, "He left nothing to chance, except the technology. He underestimated how far digital forensics had come." And that was true. The more they combed through the data, the more Clay's digital trail worked against him. He had tried to impersonate a dead woman. He had tried to rewrite the timeline, but technology kept the original narrative intact and unflinching. The emerging evidence wasn't just about proving Clay was at the scene. It was about demonstrating that he had meticulously manipulated the aftermath. And it was that manipulation, more than any spontaneous act, that painted the portrait of premeditation. It took investigators just 12 days after the discovery of Chanin Starbuck's body to reach the man they believed responsible. But the road to trial would take over a year. Clay Starbuck was formally charged with first-degree murder and sexually motivated aggravated murder in early 2012. The charges reflected not only the brutality of the crime, but the specific nature of how the victim had been posed, manipulated, and dehumanized after death. Prosecutors made it clear this wasn't just about a homicide, it was about hatred turned ritual. As the trial opened in May 2013, Spokane County Superior Court became the stage where 6 months of forensic work, hundreds of digital records, and the psychological unraveling of a failed marriage converged. Every seat in the gallery was filled. On one side, the children of Chanin and Clay, torn between the parents who raised them, now forced to confront the reality that one might have murdered the other. On the other, friends, detectives, digital analysts, and a public trying to understand how a suburban divorce devolved into something so deeply violent. The state's case was built layer by layer, beginning with forensic evidence. Multiple crime scene technicians testified to the condition of the body, including the deliberate posing and staging, which prosecutors argued was intended to degrade Chanin's memory and shift suspicion toward her online relationships. But the defense theory that some unknown online date may have been responsible quickly unraveled under technical scrutiny. Experts presented data from the family's home Wi-Fi router, which showed no evidence of intrusion. The phone records became a cornerstone. Clay's voice and data logs placed him near Chanin's house multiple times in the critical window of December 1st to 2. And most damning of all, digital forensics revealed that Chanin's phone had been accessed after her estimated time of death. From that device, sexually charged messages were sent to multiple men from her online dating accounts long after she had died. The prosecution argued convincingly, these weren't from Chanin. They were sent by Clay Starbuck to paint her as promiscuous, to create noise around the investigation, and to give himself distance. Clay's DNA had been located not just inside the home, but on Chanon's face, neck, and under her fingernails, specifically within the contusion and hemorrhage zones. Pathologists testified that the bruising on her throat, petechiae in her eyes, and lack of defensive wounds pointed to a surprise attack, likely from someone she trusted. The absence of forced entry supported that narrative. So did the washing machine, running when police arrived, filled with bedding. The exterior of the washer had been wiped clean. To the jury, this looked like the work of someone who wanted to erase what had happened in that room. The defense attempted to discredit the timing and validity of DNA, arguing transfer could have happened earlier. They introduced the theory of a third party, but their story lacked traction. Cross-examinations revealed inconsistencies in Clay's own alibi. He claimed to be fixing a car while his phone was dead, but cell tower pings didn't align, and his timeline collapsed under digital pressure. After 3 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for just 2 days. On June 4, 2013, Clay Dwayne Starbuck was convicted of first-degree murder with sexual motivation. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At sentencing, he maintained his innocence, stating, "I did not kill Chanon." But there was no sign of a hung jury. The verdict was unanimous. Yet the story didn't close there. In the years that followed, Clay Starbuck continued to file motions for appeal and post-conviction relief. His legal team pushed for new DNA testing under Washington state's updated statutes, claiming that not all biological material had been analyzed. In 2021, news broke of renewed legal action seeking post-conviction DNA examination. His family maintained that key evidence had been ignored, including male DNA mixtures allegedly found on Chanon's body that did not match Clay. But the Spokane County Prosecutor's Office responded firmly. All critical evidence, they argued, had already been tested and considered. The conviction had held through appeals. And while justice must always allow room for new science, the case, based on the totality of physical, digital, and behavioral evidence, remained intact. As of July 27, 2025, Clay remains incarcerated at the Airway Heights Correction Center, still listed as serving a life sentence without parole. His name continues to surface in advocacy circles, questioning wrongful convictions, but the facts remain unchanged in the eyes of the state. There is no satisfaction in watching families torn apart by violence. The courtroom is not a stage for resolution. It is where wounds are measured, where evidence replaces emotion, and where lives once entangled must now confront hard separation. 5 children live with the shadow of a crime that ended one parent's life and condemned the other to prison. No verdict can undo that. But the system, however imperfect, followed its process. It listened to the blood, the data, the silence of a wiped phone, and the scream of a washing machine left running. The story of Chanon Starbuck is not just a cautionary tale of post-divorce resentment. It is a stark reminder that controlling behavior, financial threats, and emotional manipulation can escalate into irreversible destruction when institutions and individuals fail to see the red flags early. Looking back, if there's one thing I've learned from telling Chanon's story, it's this: evil doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, behind familiar faces, in the silence after divorce, in the tension that builds when control begins to slip. If you're in a relationship that leaves you feeling afraid, diminished, or unheard, please don't wait. Speak up. Get help. Your life matters. Now, I'd love to hear from you. What part of this story struck you the most? Were you familiar with this case before? Drop a comment, let me know where you're watching from, and if this video resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a true crime story that matters. And hey, if this one didn't speak to you, I still want to hear why. Your voice matters too.